Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arun Ramanathan, and I am the CEO of Pivot Learning. Welcome to our webinar, Building a School and District Culture Where Everyone Grows. We're extremely excited to have you join us today, and I'm going to take you through some points on the webinar and also some points around the agenda. I want folks to note that we do have a Q&A feature to ask questions. And we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. We will also follow up with an FAQ sheet for the webinar, the actual webinar recording, and the slide deck. So no need to take photos of the screen. You're going to get all this information afterwards, as long as you registered for the webinar. So a few points about Pivot Learning. We have been around for a very long time, 25 years. And we started as the Bay Area School Reform Collaborative. We are a nonprofit. We're located in Oakland, and our mission is to partner with educators to design and implement solutions for their greatest challenges to achieve educational justice. And we believe that real improvement in student outcomes comes through a process of collaboration, where educators can design agile solutions, measure their effectiveness and potential for sustainability, and then deploy them in our neediest schools. We work all over the country. Last year we were in 14 states. A lot of our partners are in California, but again, we tend to work in schools and districts that have very high numbers of low-income students, English learners, foster youth, and homeless youth, as that is tied to our mission and our vision of achieving educational justice. So what this work is deeply connected to also is our work around high school redesign, school redesign just in general. And we know that an essential element of that work is the work necessary around organizational culture, school culture. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the webinar, how critical that is to actually sustaining and scaling improvement. So here's our agenda. Introduction and goals. We're going to talk about what growth culture is. It's a concept that's not very well known in education. So we're doing this webinar as a kind of the first way to introduce it to you all, many of you all, although I know some of you who have been to Harvard know this deeply. We're going to hear from a case study from the superintendent, P.K. Diffenbaugh of Monterey Peninsula Unified School District. And he's going to talk about how he took on this work, how his district, how his organizational leaders at the central office level and also at the school level decided to make this a priority. And then we're going to talk to you about how you can take on this work. And we'll have some time, as I noted earlier, for some questions and answers. So I want to make a special thanks to our partners who have helped us take on this issue of organizational culture and growth culture in education, in particular, the Silver Giving Foundation, who has helped us with the resources to pioneer this work. Way to Grow, which has helped us actually measure and quantify organizational culture, again, a new concept in education. And then Dr. Lisa Leahy and Dr. Deb Helsing of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who conceptualized this work, and we'll talk more about their book and the elements of healthy organizational cultures and healthy adult development later. So here are your panelists. Myself, again, the CEO of Pivot Learning. As I noted, P.K. Diffenbaugh, Superintendent of Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, and then also pleasure to be joined by Laura Flaxman, EDLD, as a Vice President here at Pivot Learning. All right, here are our goals. We want to understand the role of culture in educational improvement. We want to learn how culture is defined and measured. We want to hear from practitioners working to improve organizational culture. And then we want to give you the opportunity to take this back and learn how to do this work in your district and school. Why are we taking this on? I think it's very fundamental. Pivot is an organization that has worked in school districts for 25 years. I have worked in many different educational organizations at the district level and at the school level. And the one thing I've noted over and over again, and the one thing that we have noted in Pivot, working with over 100 districts on many different types of educational improvement strategies is that one of the biggest barriers to sustaining and scaling those changes, those improvements, particularly the improvements in student learning, is organizational culture. That is the place where most things either live or die. If you have a healthy culture, you have a chance to succeed, and that initiative has the chance to succeed and grow at the school and classroom level and at the district level. And unhealthy cultures are the biggest barriers. Compliance-based toxic cultures are often the biggest barriers to growth, improvement, and sustained change in student outcomes. And so we're going to make that link in the course of this webinar, and we're going to ask folks to stop ignoring adults, their development, and organizational culture as part of this work. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Laura Flaxman, who will actually talk about what is growth culture. Laura?
Great, thank you. So I just want to recognize too that it looks like Deb Helsing and Lisa Leahy are on this call, so just, feels a little awkward to be sharing their work and talking about this part of it, but really excited that you're here. So really quickly, just a thought exercise for you that we'll actually poll and see what everyone who is online right now thinks about this question. To what extent do you feel as if you are personally growing and developing in your current job? So there will be a poll feature that should show up on your screen momentarily. There it is. And so there's the question. To what extent do you feel as if you are personally growing and developing in your current job? And just answer with your response. Maybe just another couple seconds on that, and then we'll see what the consensus is or the average is from all of your answers. Okay. Okay, I don't see it yet. Published poll. There it is. Great. Oh, that's excellent. Actually, it might be somewhat the nature of the people who have decided to join this particular webinar, but I think that's a little higher than some other groups might have. But there's 6 people. That's a huge number that really feel that that's true every day, which is excellent, and quite a few more who are at often, and then there's definitely a few of you that might be more typical in some other crowds that are down under sometimes and rarely. But this, at its heart, is the nature of this work. So if you could turn to the next slide, please. And as Arun mentioned, what we have done here at Pivot is really based on the excellent work of Drs. Keegan, Leahy, Helsing, and others who wrote this book called In Everyone Culture, Becoming a Deliberately Developmental Organization, which is really about this idea of building a culture, a work environment where everybody grows and learns every day. And that is the work that we tried to take up here, and we're fortunate to be able to partner with PK and the Monterey Peninsula Unified School District, which again we'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment. But first, a little bit more on what this whole idea of growth culture is. So this slide is courtesy of Way to Grow, one of the partners that Arun mentioned earlier. Basically, there's an old paradigm for what growth at work was about, and professional development is what we've mostly called it in education circles. And in the 20th century, and sort of the old paradigm of what that looks like is very much top down, very much like to this individual, and kind of, as you can see, all those arrows are going down from the hierarchy to the people, and there's no cross-fertilization, and there's no real growing and learning and supporting one another to do that. In this 21st century paradigm, which is what growth culture and deliberately developmental organizations are all about, you can see it's really around being multi-directional, and also that the leader is just as much able to learn and grow, and models that. And some of those arrows are around feedback and getting having these conversations about people's personal and professional development across all kinds of roles, and even just that level of conversation has not been super typical. The other piece that is usually true in schools especially is that it's like a thing that you do episodically, right? That you'll like go and have a staff retreat, or you have this professional development opportunity, and then you come back and it's sort of business as usual. The whole idea of growth culture is that it's every day, everybody, and it's baked into the nature of people's daily work. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the components as outlined again, in an everyone culture. And there are 3 aspects of this growth culture. Oops. Just go back to the other one, sorry for a minute. So the idea is that home, edge, and groove are, and there's an intersection of these things where growth culture exists. So now I guess we can slide to the next one, but home is really this environment of trust and support and challenge, and, creating that community where people are able to learn and grow and be vulnerable. The idea that everybody needs a crew, that, the optimal development and learning really happens in a community and not in isolation. Everybody builds a culture, and rank doesn't give you a pass, as I mentioned before. Edge, what's that challenge side of growth, right? And again, this idea, which Lisa Leahy and Robert Keegan definitely helped pioneer, that you don't stop growing when you're an adult. It's not just children who can grow, adults can also. And so this work is very much based in adult development principles. And, at its center is the idea that weaknesses and errors are opportunities for learning and for growth. And that growing people matters for all of us as humans and is intertwined with our success at work and, with really achieving whatever the mission is, whatever the bottom line is of your organization. And lastly, groove are all those practices that help to nurture growth and community. They're owned by everyone, they're job embedded, and they recur. So again, they're not that old model of episodic, occasional experiences, but they're really a part of the everyday experience of work. And again, the other piece of this is, it's an investment in growth, not just efficiency, and that practices welcome and develop the whole person, and in the case of, schools and districts, the whole educator, including their interior world and what goes on inside people's heads and thoughts. So very, very briefly, we had the really amazing opportunity, which was pretty unique in all of our experience, and including our partners at Harvard, of doing this work at a really wholesale systems level with a school district, which has not been done before. And just want to appreciate Allison Rowland's contributions here, who was a consultant that we had brought on to help us develop this work, and who did a lot of the on-the-ground work with Monterey Peninsula. We started with a survey that was through our partners at Way to Grow, and opened it to the entire school district, and that included custodial staff, clerical support, superintendent, principals, teachers. We also did focus groups, interviews, meetings, observations, and then we assembled a growth culture design team made up of the Human Resources Department in Monterey Peninsula Unified, as well as 4 school sites, 3 elementaries and 1 middle school. And then we worked for the course of a year having these regular 10 half-day design team meetings, all focused on learning growth culture practices, and then planning and implementing those practices at the individual sites. And then at the end of the whole process, we re-administered the growth culture survey. And I'm going to turn it over to PK to talk about what that experience was like and some of the results of the work.
Much. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and to share with you a little bit of our learning. I think first I'll just say we're in the very beginning of this. And so by no means do we feel like we have mastered any of this work, but we're very much happy to share our learning. Just to give you an overview of Monterey Peninsula, many people think of Pebble Beach when they think of Monterey, and they might assume that our district is extremely wealthy. And our district encompasses Monterey, Seaside, marina, about 10,000 students, 70% of which qualify for free reduced lunch, majority of which are Latino, 60%. And we have a very interesting and dynamic history of a district that unified because of to integrate the schools, as well as the history of Fort Ord being in our region, which had a huge presence. And when Fort Ord closed in 1994, that was a huge impact to the region and to the school district. In terms of kind of who we are, we believe in all kids, and our vision is to be one of the finest public school systems in the country. We know that we are a long way from achieving that vision, but we're committed to that. And from the very beginning, we implemented some values around every person matters, each day counts, learn something new every day, improve with purpose, and we're better together. And so we really tried to build a foundation around the values that I think are very much in line with adult development and with this growth culture work. But why we started this work, I think, fundamentally, the work of education and districts, I think, is a learning challenge, meaning we do not know what we are trying to do. We must learn how to do it. The system was not set up for all kids to be successful. And so we have to learn how to transform our system so that that happens. So it's a learning challenge. And I think that districts are some of the worst organizations for adult learning, almost by design. And so we felt like we needed support in order to transform our system into a learning organization and to implement some of our values around every person matters and improving with purpose. Only other thing I would say about our district context that I do think is important is when I got here, I was the 7th superintendent in 10 years. And so the level of trust, the level of disorganization was we were a wounded system. That's how I described it. We were a wounded system. And so we very much knew the work ahead was about rebuilding trust, was about rebuilding relationships. And this work that you'll see that we did, I think, very much helped us along that path. So we did a baseline survey, and I think really it asked along the EDGE home groove that you heard Laura talk about was where do you see yourself, and then where is your desired future? And so as you can see in each area, and this was again a survey across the entire district, you can see a pretty substantial gap between where people see their current reality versus their aspirations. And when you dig into the data a little bit further, we did it by school site, and this is our elementary schools. You can see that we don't necessarily have one culture at MPUSD, but you see that depending on the school site, there's very different experiences, most of which have very large gaps between how they view their current reality versus their aspirations. You do see in the school up top, Monte Vista was part of our pilot, really had a much smaller gap. So we had some bright spots already to work with and to kind of understand what they were doing well. But by and large, you saw a pretty large gap. We broke it down also by race, ethnicity, and that gave us some good information. You can see gaps across the board, but particularly with our African American staff and our multiracial staff, we noticed that their current reality versus their aspirations were the largest in the district. And so I think that was certainly an important data point to me as we began planning and doing our design process. We also looked at teachers and depending on their experience. And in this data, years 5 through 10 stood out as the biggest gaps, and that is in line with where we usually have the biggest amount of turnover and attrition. So it was not surprising, but again, it was a data point to say, well, perhaps if we can improve our culture, that can also improve our retention, which is one of our big challenges across the district. And the go back one, sorry, the DO. So this was good data as well. You could see that the district office personnel in general rated themselves lower than at school sites, and particularly here, when we broke it down to our cabinet level, you saw some of the biggest gaps between our cabinet's aspirations and their current reality. And so that was important for me as a leader. And when you talk about, no one gets a pass in this work, that was very much a mirror to my leadership to say, what conditions am I creating for my own leadership team to experience Edge, Home, and Groove, and what do I need to do to help that process. So that data was all very important and helpful. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over back to Laura to talk about some of the strategies.
Great, thank you. So with the design team that was assembled after seeing the data that PK just walked you through, we really designed the team to look at each of these different components of a growth culture. So we spent a bunch of time doing some practices and modeling practices that then people took, in their team time and had some planning time at these meetings to bring back to their sites for how to develop home. Some of those are, what are some connector activities? What are activities and exercises that people could build into their regular meetings, as a way of just building relationships and for people to get to know each other better? What are some ways of really expanding the idea of people being able to be vulnerable with one another? We definitely relied on some of Brene Brown's work for that, and really, did some trust building to really build that community of safety, both among the individual teams that were participating and also as this larger team of all 5 sites and their growth culture teams. And then again, they went back to their own communities and did some of those same things and other things also. We did particular practices around growing edge and people's ability to learn and grow. Some of those really looked like quite a bit of time spent on how do we give and receive feedback? What are protocols for doing that, for receiving feedback, for pushing people on their work, for pushing people on their learning and their thinking? And then finally, and a lot of these are the practices that we worked on. We helped people implement Groove and come up with, well, how are we going to start all of our staff meetings? What are some different things that we're going to, put into place back at our own sites that are regular practices baked into our daily work that build home, that build edge, that build Groove, and overall build a growth culture? So I'm going to turn it again back to PK to just talk about the kind of results and the impact of this work.
Great, thank you. So I think when we started this pilot, it was around the springtime, and I was initially very hesitant because one of the things that I get feedback on is the amount of work that we're doing, the amount of the different initiatives that we've taken on, and my hesitancy was around, well, is this going to be one more thing? And the pivot team really talked about, this isn't one more thing. This is about making all the things you do more coherent in allowing your people to experience success. So we launched forward, and I was very pleased in that this really became an energizing experience for the pilot members. So individuals were looking forward to coming to the PD, the once a month half day, and they were taking what they were learning back to their sites, implementing. And what was really interesting and I was happy to see as they really became kind of their own learning community where they were sharing information, in between, and reflections, and some spontaneous celebrations. And so, that was a really great development. And I think that in terms of learning, I visit a lot of sites, and different folks have pulled me aside, whether it was librarians, teachers, counselors, to tell me that this was one of the most important professional and personal experiences that they've gone through. And so that was very rewarding for me as well, to see is that we're really starting to connect kind of the personal growth and professional growth, and really, I think, embracing really at its heart what growth culture is about and what adult development really is. And so some of the things that we did when we did the culture survey post-survey, we found that there was improvement across the board in home, edge, and groove for districts staff that was engaged in the process. Our human resources department, which was our only district level participant, showed the most growth as compared to other district departments. And that was significant in that, for me, it really showed we need to get different departments into doing this work, not just the school sites. Two of our schools stood out. Marina Vista showed tremendous growth after the pilot in terms of where they see themselves and their ambitions. And then Monte Vista, which was the school I mentioned earlier, they were already rated extremely high in the baseline survey, but also improved. And so that was important for me to see, is that, even the higher performing sites have improvement, and this work is for them as well. So next steps for us is we really want to continue to support the pilot sites and the pilot teams, and they've requested that they really very much want continued support in integrating these practices into their everyday school experiences, and really continuing to grow. And then we're considering a second cohort, and the way we structured our cohorts were individual teams opted in and applied to be a part of it. And so we're considering doing that again. But as I mentioned, really trying to diversify so that more district level departments are taking part in it, in addition to school sites. So with that, I will send it back over to Laura to talk about how you can take on this work.
Sorry, I'm muted there. So this work for us is definitely in the context of some of our school and district redesign work and improvement efforts. As Arun mentioned in the intro, Pivot does a bunch of work in a number of areas, but all sort of under the umbrella of really supporting districts and schools and systems to improve in whatever the area is. We have a really fabulous opportunity, particularly as it relates to this work and the great work that Monterey Peninsula Unified has been doing in this upcoming Growth Culture and Continuous Improvement Symposium at the end of this month, February 27th and 28th in Monterey, which is a great place to visit on top of everything else. And that is also, the other piece we didn't necessarily get into in this particular webinar is that we have been working in partnership with Monterey for a number of years as well on helping redesign two of their secondary schools. And we see, in our work of doing school redesign and school improvement efforts, there are so many barriers when the adult culture isn't really strong. And so this work around, like, how do you take a more developmental approach to work with adults and really pay attention to that adult culture, it's a really key part of our approach that really makes a difference, as Arun framed in the beginning when he was expressing what the problem and the challenges are in schools and districts. So this is a fabulous opportunity. You'll see the RSVP link is on there, and it's free to attend, and we'd love to have anybody who's online or not who'd like to join and learn more. And as it says, and I just explained, but opportunity to really learn how growth culture can be used to transform and redesign systems in schools. So it's not just doing it for its own sake, it's doing it because of the impact that this work can have in terms of students and student achievement. And so, there are a number of different ways to partner with Pivot. And actually ways that aren't even listed here necessarily, because we do a larger range of work, but in particular around this, there's this growth culture assessment, which, as PK explained, even just doing that baseline survey that first time was really eye-opening, and there was a lot of learning that just came from that right away. And then we also, as I mentioned, do school and district improvement work around, at the systems level in terms of the district level, and also in terms of individual school redesign, school design, and turnaround efforts. So we'd love to hear more from any of you who are interested in learning a little bit more about that. And again, you'll have tons of opportunity to interact with not just PK, but also a lot of the members of the growth culture pilot and the different school sites and district offices down there if you take advantage of this symposium. So I'm going to turn it over to Arun to moderate some question and answers, and we're happy to answer some of those questions.
Great. So thank you, Laura, and also thank you, PK. Please, if folks could submit using the Q&A function any questions that you might have. We have plenty of time now for questions, but I'm going to kick it off with a few questions. And the first one really is one that I've gotten a lot around this work itself, which is, what's the point, right? Like, why are you focusing on this instead of doing professional development on to improve student achievement for teachers, or, social emotional learning, or those types of things? And the first is, what's the point? And then second is, what is the connection to student achievement and outcomes for students? And maybe I could kick this back to PK first to talk about that, but then over to Laura.
Sure. So I don't think it's an either or, right? So I do think there's a time and place for professional development around more technical skills. But I think that the point is that if you have not set up the conditions for which people are, if you don't have the trust there, if you haven't set up the conditions where they're practicing regularly, and that there are specific practices that are ingrained into your organization, then all other kind of professional development, I think, is going to be experienced as a one-shot type deal. And I think there's many, many studies that show that in general, professional development does not move practice very effectively. So I think the point of this is to set up your organization so that the work that you do around the technical professional development is intertwined with the work you're doing with the personal and professional growth, so that ultimately you're growing in your practice. And I think, how does it impact kids? As I mentioned in the beginning, we don't know, the system is not set up to serve all kids well. So we need to learn. And I do think having people engage in continuous improvement and learning ultimately leads to better outcomes for students.
Do you have anything to add on that?
I think PK, we did a great job.
Okay. All right. Great. So we got another question here. How much buy-in do you need before you start a process like this, and from whom? The leader of the school, the department, or is the superintendent enough?
Why don't I start with that one, and then, and then it'd be good to have you add to it, PK. But I would say for sure, and this is something, we've really experienced to different degrees, and I know it's true talking to some of my colleagues around the country who have tried, to different extents to implement some of this. The leader is so absolutely essential. And I would say it doesn't matter what the unit of that leadership is. Of course, if you're trying to do district level culture change like PK is, it has to be PK. And you could have a department leader, you could have a school site leader who has that level of commitment. It's not one of these things, though, because of that importance of kind of flattening the idea of adult development and learning and growth and people's potential and capacity for growth, and the importance of vulnerability and building that, that real community of trust. You have to have the leader of whatever the unit is that is trying to take this on fully on board. So I don't know, as that leader, PK, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you definitely obviously have to have the senior leadership team. The superintendent needs to be invested in it, for sure. But I would say that you can start relatively small, like we did. Four school sites in one department is relatively small for our district, and I think that the key is that what you do has to be extremely high quality in order to get that initial buy-in. So I think that many people signed up. Their teams were a little bit skeptical about, what is this, and why am I doing this? But then the quality of the professional development and the community that was created was so strong that it really did lead to more hunger for more. And so that would be, I would say, start small, but make sure that it's of really good quality, and that it will build from there.
And PK, just a quick question. Why did you pick those 4 schools? Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about the characteristics around them, or why did they pick themselves, and then why the Human Resources Department?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So they picked themselves. We put it out to everyone and allowed them, but I did make some follow-up calls to some of the principals, and it was a real mix from, Monte Vista, which was already scoring, off the charts, to schools that we felt like needed some support in terms of building a culture. So I did, have some nudging. It wasn't a directive, but it was kind of, hey, I think this would be good for you and your team. I want you to try it. And then Human Resources Department, I think, like many traditional systems, our Human Resources Department is very traditional, and I don't think really views themselves as a unit that is in charge or should be in charge of growing individuals. And so we really wanted to introduce the adult development principles and growth culture into the HR unit so that they really began to see their role differently. And I think it started, certainly has not transformed completely, but I think we have started that process, and this was instrumental.
So got a number of questions along this line. What should we expect? What do you expect of an organization that would like to take on this work? And then what happens once they take it on in the once-a-month meeting, and what do the sessions look like? Those types of things. So what are there conditions in order to take it on? What should an organization expect? And then what happens in the meetings?
It's a great question. And I do want to tie it back to the rest of Catherine Short's question. Hi, Catherine. Which is just around like the just some of the buy-in pieces. I think to the question of, is the superintendent enough or just the superintendent? I think one of the things we found, and you saw in Way to Grow's survey for Monterey Peninsula Unified, is that there's a thirst for this. And for Way to Grow, who administers this survey in many, many different contexts, mostly not schools, but really across the board, and even in the little bit of work we've done with a diverse group of people, everybody's aspirations exceed their current reality. So everybody has really across the board, people are expressing a thirst for this. So on that side, there is this sort of buy-in level. Now, that being said, again, to the last question more specifically, so definitely to the leadership point, in order for readiness, there has to be somebody with positional leadership who is really fully on board, including like sort of the details of what that means. Because it's one thing to be like, yeah, this is great work. It's another thing to then be really willing to model the kind of vulnerability, and, because it's so important that the leader really be the modeler of this work, and that actually gets to a question further down also to some extent. And then specifically in terms of like, so just to be really clear, this particular form of the way we did this work in Monterey Peninsula is called a pilot for a reason. I think there are many different ways to try to do this work and for Pivot to support this work. And we've also done a bunch of work in the same vein at Pivot. And it looks different in different places, and there's many different ways to do that. So in some ways, this idea of having a design team and pulling people out is actually antithetical to the whole idea of growth culture, which is that it's job embedded and it's nothing extra. That being said, I think it was a very effective way to really jumpstart the work. And some of those sessions, again, to the question of exactly what happened, there were some baseline work around like, what is this? What are we even talking about? I mean, some of what we've been doing here, like what is home, what is edge, what is groove, what are these practices? And then, and in the case of the pilot in Monterey Peninsula, like just the feedback piece alone, giving and receiving feedback, that was a bunch of sessions on like, okay, we're going to actually practice, we're going to role play, we're going to, try out these different protocols, and same with the home building activities also. So there was both, like really content and knowledge building, and then also, practicing. The other thing we found in the pilot was that if we didn't model it, like, because I had assembled a bunch of resources for people to take away with them on like practices that build edge, practices that build home. If we didn't model it in the meetings, it was less likely to happen at the individual sites when people were taking the work with them. Because there is a power to experiencing the kind of culture that we're talking about building. And so that was powerful. That being said, again, there's different ways to do it. There's working with the leadership teams and doing some coaching, which is what we've done in Oceanside, which is really around like, all right, let's work with the school leaders and do some coaching around, and still modeling in that smaller setting, but then, helping them implement the actual practices with their staff.
So Laura, basically, if I can sum up what you were saying is that we led people through a series of sessions where they were building both their knowledge and the practices of home edge and groove, and they were utilizing that as a way in the pilots also to translate that throughout their department, and also once they went back to their schools, throughout the schools. And again, organizational conditions are going to differ from site to site or from school to school. So the design process and bringing a team together allows for that variation to happen. One of the questions, though, that's consistently coming up too is just around the question of what's the interaction between what happens at the site level and what happens at the district level? Is it possible, for instance, for a site to take this on if the district is dysfunctional? And then what happened? So that's the first question, and then I'll ask a follow-up around that.
So, do you want me to try to?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that yes, it's possible for a site to do it if the district is dysfunctional, but it will likely stay at that site, and probably there's already a gap in terms of organizational effectiveness between the site and the district already if the site's willing to take it on and the district's dysfunctional, and that will just continue to grow. But it is possible, but it's not going to create kind of the lasting systemic change that I think we all want to see for our kids, but it's certainly possible. But I would say that in terms of the interaction between the sites and the district, it was very imperative that we had all the teams integrated, because I think the site often feels like, well, we're doing things, but the district doesn't, or the district isn't as invested in their own growth, but they want us to grow. So I think it was important that we showed it. I mean, I think if I had to do it over again, I probably would have had the cabinet team also do the pilot with the rest of the teams, because I think some of the feedback at the end was kind of like, this is great, and I really think this was important, but like, what's senior leadership? How are they learning? And I feel like we are invested in our own learning, but I think we could have shown that by joining in. and I think that that's obviously would be the ideal.
So, in terms of practical, some of the, kind of like the HR systems and the organizational systems, do you see the work changing those things down the line? Kind of these technical elements of people's evaluation and professional development? And I'll throw that both to Laura and PK.
Definitely. I mean, I think it should. We've already changed our evaluation tool, and while it's not aligned necessarily to anything we did in the pilot, it certainly takes a more growth-minded approach, and we really reframed it. We worked with our union on this about evaluation should be about growth. It shouldn't be about a gotcha type thing. And so I do think that the work that that goes on will transform the ways in which you do things and the systems that you set up. Now there is obviously you have to do your reports to the state, and a lot of stuff that you just got to do. But I do think in HR, for example, there are folks in there who I don't think have ever been asked, what do you want to, how do you want to grow? What is your aspirations? And how can we support you to do that? And I think the fact that they were asked and they start thinking that way, I think does translate into how they interact with new teachers, how they set up the induction program, how we go about, matching student teachers with mentor teachers. I do think it has a big impact across the board if they begin to understand what adult development is and what it takes to grow. I think it does have an impact.
Yeah, and I, just very specifically, every single one of the teams did change their systems and practices to be reflective of this work. Interesting, you mentioned, evaluation is a tricky one, and we talked about that in the design team meeting also, because it's very important that there be space for people to grow in ways they want to grow, and so there's certain places where that doesn't mesh, and you also don't want people being penalized because they've shared that there's something they're not good at. Typically we're trying to hide all that in our work environments, and that's one of the things that this work turns on its head. But that being said, they each had just different, even something as small as ways of appreciating each other as a staff, like practices on a regular basis. And actually your HR department they're the ones who did the little thank you notes. I mean, just something came directly out of, so it might seem small, but these were sort of new little just practices and systems, sometimes bigger. I know one of the schools, their evaluation, their walkthrough and observation system was really impacted by the work that they did. So I think there were lots of examples of some of those, technical systems that were impacted and changed and developed through this process.
So I just got a question on the impact on students. A couple of times, both of you pointed out one particular elementary school that scored really high in this work. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the relationship, more explicitly on what do you think the relationship is between the assessment of growth culture and how student performance is either improved or those improvements are sustained?
Sure. So, that's one school that has a very dynamic school leader who has been able to create kind of a culture of instructional improvement that is extremely powerful. And he's gotten everyone on board. They do site instructional rounds where the academic coach and the principal take over the classroom and then allow teachers to visit each other and reflect on their practice, etc. So, I would say that without this dynamic leader there, I think that's where the results are, is because of his leadership and what he's brought and what his team has created. With that said, uh, their involvement has really taken it to the next level. And so they've started to integrate some of the practices that they learned into their staff meetings. And one of the things that's important for that leader that he really is reflecting on, and I think really got pushed in this, is that he has to release his leadership more to the staff in order for them to grapple with and grow in their own development. And so I think that's kind of the next level of the work for the school. And this process, I think, helped, both illuminate that and push him to see that that's what he needed to do in order to, bring it to the next level. But in terms of their scores and test results, they're doing well. They're one of our top performing and top growth schools in the district.
Laura, did you want to talk a little bit about that?
I think, it's part of our hypothesis, and it'll be really interesting to see, like the standout school from the pilot that we're, the one school that really had the most significant growth in terms of the culture indicators. It will be interesting to see, if there's then a correlation the next time there are student, results out. And, that's our hypothesis. And there is, data outside of this particular body of work that, does link, culture and, and even, teacher satisfaction and, the sort of adults flourishing with, schools that work better. One of the, there's a certain level of just, common sense that says, wow, if adults are really feeling like they're growing and thriving, and learning, won't they be so much better in how they show up with kids? And that was also interesting in the pilot. Again, there's no hard data around this yet, but there were so many conversations around, okay, how are we translating this with kids? If we're building this adult, we're building our culture as adults, how are we modeling those same practices? For example, even that appreciation piece, and that, like, then a lot of the schools were then saying, okay, let's actually build in some time for kids to appreciate one another and to offer that same, that same appreciation, which is, a form of, that's a great part of growth culture right there.
The only thing I would say is, this has to be part of a larger vision around systemic improvement that is going to take time. If you're looking to bump your reading scores up by 5 to 10%, I would suggest a specific reading program that you drill into the kids. If that's what your goal is. If you're looking for over time creating the conditions in which adults are enjoying coming to work, feel like they are growing as professionals in a community that's both challenging and supportive, and that kids will benefit from that type of culture. That's a longer term horizon. Ultimately, do I think my test scores will go up because of this? Yes, but is that the reason why we're doing this? No.
That's great. So on that point too, there's a couple of pieces of data that you shared that were quite striking. One was the differences by race, African American teachers, and then the other by, where your teachers were in their career trajectory. Mm-hmm. How are you seeing this work helping around, some of the racial issues or the teacher tenure issues and retention issues that you're facing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. And I do think we have a lot of work to do around growing our consciousness, around our growing racial consciousness. We have done some work with Pacific Education Group on courageous conversations, and there is a lot of intersection between the work around, essentially both are saying, how do we bring our best selves to the work every day? But we need to grow in our ability to understand more around the experiences of our teachers of color, of our staff of color, to better understand how we can kind of take this, how growth culture applies in in a more diverse context, probably. So I don't have a great answer, obviously, for that, other than it's something that we continue to grapple with, and we're committed to. I think for us, again, it's part of a larger systemic approach around diversifying our workforce. Our teaching force is 80% Caucasian, and our district is over 80% students of color. So we have some really systemic issues to deal with. I do think this can be a part of it. I don't think it's alone. I think there's some other things that we're doing and need to do. But yeah, I mean, it's a work in progress.
What about the data that you saw on retention? And then there's another chart that we didn't show. I know you pointed it out before on your class, the differences between your classified and your certificate.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that was I don't think it was surprising, but it's very stark in terms of classified staff, their desire to grow versus how they are experiencing the current reality was very large. And I think that from the beginning, when I got here, there was a consistent kind of narrative around we're not valued, we're not supported, we never get professional development. And I think that data kind of bared that out. And so we have taken steps to really improve how we are approaching professional development around our classified staff. And we are changing the culture around the feeling of, hey, I'm part of this team. So for example, we had classified staff members in each of the pilot teams intentionally, on purpose, because we really wanted to communicate that growth culture is not just something for teachers and administrators. This is for the entire school site, and classified staff are part of the team. And so I do think we're making some strides there. In terms of teachers, years 5 to 10, that's also a challenge that we're having. We find we lose a lot of teachers in that age group. I don't think it's just the cultures of our schools. We think it has to do with starting a family, wanting to buy a house, and some different factors outside of our control. But it's certainly something that we are aware of and trying to address in a number of ways.
That's great. All right. Well, I think we've got come to the end of the questions, and I'd like to turn it back over really quickly to Laura. If an organization, if a school, a district wanted to take this on, either in the work on at the district level or in the school redesign level, what should they expect? We have obviously our contacts here, way to reach us, to learn more about the process, but what should they expect once they start this work?
Yeah, I think part of how we work with everybody is, as we've said, it's a real partnership. So it's very much around, one thing that's common is this idea of having a diverse group of people and engaging a school or a district's community across lines, even the way PK was just talking about, and who was in a part of that pilot at the site level redesign work that we do, and even district level redesign. Super important to us to assemble a design team and have a design process, and also to articulate really clearly with the partner school or district or organization what the challenge is and what it is that what's the problem and the design challenge that people want to solve. And so that's kind of the first step, and that answers, Michelle, your question about just how is this located in our school redesign work. Is that it's embedded in this process that is very much collaborative around designing both the process and the solutions in a way that makes sense for our particular partner and what the particular partner's challenges are. But yes, the very first step is just reaching out to our colleague Robert Curtis. Feel free to find Arun or myself as well, but he's sort of set up and excited to respond to you all, and so that would definitely be first. And again, like I said before, really welcome to join us in Monterey as well for this symposium, but we'd love to hear from you.
All right. There are plenty of questions on the Q&A, and as noted, everybody will get an answer after the webinar from us. We will also send the Q&A and the slides. The growth culture assessment slides are quite remarkable, the ones that you've seen, both the pre and some of the post data. So you'll also be able to see those when we send you the webinar slide deck. And again, thank you so much for joining us. This is probably the first time in several decades of in education that I've participated in a webinar on school and district culture and efforts to improve it as the basis for continuous improvement. I hope this is not the last one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And by the way, thank you, PK, also for your great work.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that of your team. And thanks, Laura.
Thank you.